Sometimes the smallest among us carry the biggest hearts. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what truly matters. In a harsh Norse village, there lived a nameless girl they called the Stray. Her real name was Elja, and she survived on scraps and silence. That changed when she saw Bjarke, the giant Viking war leader, being attacked by traitors in the marketplace. With no weapon and no armor, Elja threw herself into the fight. She took beating after beating meant for the chieftain. She nearly died for a man she barely knew. When Bjarke woke up and saw her broken but breathing, something changed in his warrior heart. Word spread fast through the village. The next morning, 1,000 warriors stood outside her hut with their heads bowed. What they did next would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the memories of old battles, and in the settlement of Raven's Hollow, life moved with the rhythm of survival that had sustained these people for generations. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying the scent of pine and salt air, while the distant sound of hammers on anvils provided a steady heartbeat to the awakening day. This was a place where every soul knew their purpose, where bloodlines traced back to legendary warriors, and where honor was measured not in gold, but in the strength of one's sword arm and the loyalty of one's heart. But not every soul belonged. Elja pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of Thorkel's forge, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air as she watched the village come to life. At 17 winters, she had learned to read the rhythms of this place like a sailor reads the wind, knowing when to move, when to hide, when to make herself invisible. Her torn cloak, patched with scraps of different fabrics, wrapped around her thin frame like a map of her struggles. Each patch told a story of survival, of nights spent huddled against the cold, of meals found in the generosity of strangers or the refuse of the more fortunate. The forge, where she often slept, belonged to Thorkel the Black, a gruff but kind-hearted smith whose wife Astrid had taken pity on the orphaned girl 3 summers ago. They never spoke of it directly. Such was not the Norse way, but they left scraps of bread near the back door and never chased her away when she sought shelter from winter storms. Thorkel's hammer rang against hot iron, each strike precise and purposeful, shaping weapons that would serve warriors in distant lands. The metal remembers every blow, Thorkel had once told her, not looking up from his work. Just as we remember every kindness, every cruelty. It all shapes us, girl. All of it. Elja understood this wisdom more than most. Her own life had been shaped by countless small cruelties. The turned backs, the whispered words, the way conversations stopped when she approached. But also by unexpected kindnesses, Astrid's silent meals, old Gunnar's discarded fishing nets that became blankets, young Sven's shy smile when he thought no one was watching. She had no memory of her parents, only fragments that might have been dreams, a woman's voice singing lullabies, strong hands lifting her toward starlight, the smell of herbs and honey. The village elders claimed she had appeared one winter morning as a babe, left at the temple of Frigg with nothing but a name carved into a piece of whalebone. Elja. Some whispered she was cursed, others that she was blessed. Most simply forgot she existed. The marketplace began to stir as merchants arranged their wares. Harald the fishmonger displayed his morning catch on beds of seaweed, while Ingrid, the baker's apprentice, carried wooden trays of dark bread that made Elja's empty stomach clench with longing. The scent of fresh fish and warm bread mingled with the ever-present smell of wood smoke and leather, creating the familiar perfume of home, even for those who had no true home to claim. Elja's stomach growled, a sound she had long since learned to ignore. She had eaten yesterday, fish scraps from Harald's generosity, and a heel of bread that Astrid had accidentally dropped near the forge door. It was more than many days brought, and she was grateful. Hunger was an old companion, no longer sharp but constant, like the ache in bones that comes from too many nights on hard ground. Movement near the great hall caught her attention. Warriors were gathering, their mail shirts glinting in the early sunlight. These were Bjarke's men, the elite guard of the war leader who had united 3 rival clans under his banner. She had seen him only from a distance, a giant of a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. They called him Bjarke the Unbreakable, and stories of his prowess had spread from Greenland to Constantinople. The warriors moved with the easy confidence of men who had faced death and found it wanting. Their weapons were well maintained, their armor battle-tested, their faces marked by scars that spoke of survived conflicts. These were not the soft nobles of southern lands, but hard men forged by the same elements that shaped their homeland: ice, iron, and unyielding stone. Among them moved Ragnar Ironsson, Bjarke's closest friend and battle brother, a man whose laugh could fill a mead hall and whose axe could cleave a shield in two. His red beard was braided with silver rings, each one a trophy from a fallen enemy. Beside him walked Olaf the Wise, keeper of laws and counselor to the war leader, his weathered face lined with the wisdom of 60 winters. These men commanded respect wherever they traveled, their very presence a promise of protection to allies and a threat to enemies. But it was the younger warriors who fascinated Elja most. Men like Eric the Swift, barely older than herself, but already bearing the confidence of a proven fighter. Or Magnus Bearslayer, whose massive frame and gentle eyes created a contradiction that spoke to the complexity of warrior culture. They had found their place in the world, claimed their identity through courage and skill. She envied them that certainty, that belonging. The great hall itself stood as the heart of Raven's Hollow, its carved dragons and runic inscriptions telling the stories of ancestors whose deeds had become legend. Inside those walls, important decisions were made, alliances forged, and justice dispensed. It was a place of power and tradition, where bloodlines and honor determined one's worth. For someone like Elja, it might as well have been a distant star, visible but forever beyond reach. Yet even from her position outside the circle of belonging, she had learned to read the subtle signs of village politics. The way certain merchants deferred to others, the pattern of who spoke first in gatherings, the significance of seating arrangements at feasts. Power had its own language, and survival had taught her to understand it, even if she could never speak it herself. As the morning progressed, she noticed an unusual tension in the air. Warriors spoke in hushed tones, their hands resting casually on weapon hilts. Merchants glanced around nervously, and even the children seemed more subdued than usual. Something was different, though she could not yet name what. The answer came with the arrival of strangers at the marketplace, 3 men dressed as traveling merchants but carrying themselves like wolves in sheep's clothing. Their goods were fine enough, silk from distant lands, silver jewelry, spices that spoke of exotic markets, but their eyes held something cold and calculating. They set up their stall with practiced efficiency, smiling and calling out to potential customers with voices that rang just slightly false. Elja's instincts, honed by years of reading dangerous situations, told her these men brought trouble. She had seen enough genuine merchants to recognize the difference. These 3 watched everything too carefully, noted every warrior's movement, catalogued every entrance and exit. They were gathering information, though for what purpose remained unclear. The tallest of the strangers, a lean man with pale eyes and prematurely grey hair, seemed to be their leader. He wore expensive clothes, but bore calluses that spoke of weapon work rather than honest trade. When he smiled, it never reached his eyes. And when he spoke, there was an undertone of mockery that suggested he found the entire village somehow amusing. His companions were equally unsettling, one a broad-shouldered brute whose merchant's robes could not hide, the muscle of a warrior, the other a thin, nervous man whose fingers never stopped moving, as if counting invisible coins or measuring invisible distances. Together, they created an atmosphere of wrongness that made even the boldest villagers unconsciously step away from their stall. But business was business, and the promise of exotic goods drew customers despite their unease. Old women examined silk scarves with practiced eyes, young men admired foreign-made knives, and children pressed close to stare at carved figurines from distant lands. The strangers smiled and haggled and played their parts well enough to fool most observers. Most, but not all. Elja watched from her hiding place as the day wore on, noting how the strangers' attention always returned to the great hall, how they asked casual questions about the war leader's habits, how they seemed particularly interested in when Bjarke might next appear in public. Her sense of wrongness grew stronger with each passing hour, like the pressure in the air before a storm, as the sun reached its zenith, painting the fjord in brilliant shades of blue and silver. The marketplace reached its daily peak of activity. Warriors mingled with farmers, craftsmen displayed their finest work, and the air filled with the sounds of commerce and community. It was in this moment of bustling normality that Elja first glimpsed the man whose fate would soon become intertwined with her own. Bjarke the Unbreakable emerged from the great hall like a force of nature given human form. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of kingdoms, he moved through the crowd with the easy grace of a man completely comfortable in his own power. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, his face marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, and his blue eyes held the depth of a man who had seen both the best and worst that life could offer. He wore no armor, only a simple woolen tunic and leather breeches, but his presence commanded more respect than any amount of steel and iron. Warriors stepped aside with nods of deference, merchants brightened at his approach, and children watched him with the awe reserved for living legends. This was a man who had earned his reputation through deed rather than boast, whose word was his bond and whose protection was absolute. But as Bjarke approached the merchant's stalls, examining goods with the eye of a man who had traveled the known world, Elja noticed something that made her blood run cold. The 3 strangers had positioned themselves with careful precision, their hands now resting on concealed weapons, their eyes locked on the war leader with predatory intensity. In that moment, she understood with crystal clarity what was about to happen. These were not merchants at all, but assassins, and they had come to Raven's Hollow with one purpose: to end the life of the man who had brought peace to these lands. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was the only one who could see the trap closing around Bjarke. Time seemed to slow as the weight of decision pressed down upon her. She was nobody, a stray girl with no name and no power. What could she possibly do against 3 trained killers? Who would believe her if she tried to raise an alarm? Who would even listen to someone like her? But as she watched Bjarke laugh at something a merchant said, his guard down and his trust in the normalcy of the moment complete, Elja realized that none of those questions mattered. Sometimes the size of your heart matters more than the size of your sword. Sometimes the smallest among us are called to do the greatest things. The strangers began to move. The attack unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance of death. The grey-haired leader approached Bjarke from the front, his smile wide and welcoming as he gestured toward a particularly fine silver armband. His words carried easily across the marketplace. Something about trade routes from the eastern kingdoms and the quality of Byzantine craftsmanship. To any observer, it appeared to be nothing more than an eager merchant trying to make his finest sale of the day. But Elja saw what others missed. The broad-shouldered assassin had circled behind Bjarke, moving with the casual gait of a man browsing wares, while his hand slowly drew a curved dagger from beneath his robes. The thin accomplice positioned himself to Bjarke's left, his nervous energy now focused into deadly purpose as he gripped what appeared to be a poisoned blade, its edge gleaming with an oily substance that caught the sunlight. Wrong. The war leader stood in the center of this closing trap, completely unaware of the death that surrounded him. His attention was fixed on the silver armband, his massive hands turning it over to examine the intricate knotwork that decorated its surface. For a moment, he looked less like the fearsome warrior whose name struck terror into his enemies and more like any craftsman appreciating fine work. "The silver comes from mines beyond the Dnieper," the lead assassin said, his voice carrying just the right note of merchant's pride. Each piece is blessed by the smiths of Kiev before the journey west. Bjarke nodded, clearly impressed by the quality. Your goods speak well of distant lands. What price do you ask for such artistry? It was the signal the killers had been waiting for. The moment Bjarke's attention focused fully on the armband, all three moved simultaneously. The leader's hand shot toward a hidden blade at his belt, while his companions closed the final distance, their weapons rising for killing strikes that would have ended the war leader's life in seconds. But Elja was already moving. Her decision came not from thought, but from something deeper, an instinct that transcended reason and embraced pure moral imperative. Later she would not remember choosing to act, only the sudden clarity that washed over her as time seemed to slow and every detail of the scene burned itself into her memory with crystalline precision. Bjarke, she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation as she launched herself from her hiding place near the forge.
Behind you!
The warning came just as the grey-haired assassin's blade cleared its sheath, the steel singing through the air toward Bjarke's exposed back. But the war leader's reflexes, honed by decades of combat, responded instantly to the girl's cry. He spun with lethal grace, his hand closing around the leader's wrist and twisting with bone-breaking force. The other two assassins pressed their attack, recognizing that their element of surprise was lost. The broad-shouldered killer lunged forward with his curved dagger, while his thin companion tried to circle for a kidney strike. But now Bjarke was alert and ready, his massive frame coiled with deadly potential. That was when Elja threw herself directly into the path of the curved blade. She had no weapon, no armor, no training, nothing but desperate courage, and the unshakable conviction that this man must not die on her watch. The dagger that should have found Bjarke's ribs instead caught her across the shoulder, the steel parting fabric and flesh with casual cruelty. Pain exploded through her body like liquid fire, but she pressed forward, her small fists hammering against the assassin's chest with surprising force. The killer, startled by this unexpected intervention, stumbled backward and tried to recover his balance. But Elja stayed close, clinging to his weapon arm with desperate strength, her weight and determination disrupting his planned attack, even as blood flowed freely from her wound. "Get away from him!" she gasped, her voice thick with pain but fierce with determination. "You will not harm him." The broad-shouldered assassin raised his fist to strike down this interfering waif, but his blow never landed. Bjarke's war hammer, drawn with lightning speed from his belt, caught the man across the temple with a sound like a tree branch snapping. The killer dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the marketplace stones like a discarded doll. Meanwhile, the thin assassin found himself facing a war leader whose full attention was now focused on the threat. Bjarke moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his hammer dancing through defensive patterns that turned aside each desperate thrust. The poisoned blade that might have killed a dozen men never came close to its target. "You chose poorly when you brought murder to my lands," Bjarke said, his voice carrying the cold promise of winter storms. His next strike shattered the assassin's weapon and sent the man sprawling across the market stones. Alive but broken, the grey-haired leader, his wrist clearly fractured from Bjarke's initial grip, tried one last desperate gambit. He pulled a second blade from his boot and lunged not at the war leader, but at Elja, perhaps thinking to use her as a hostage or simply to punish her for disrupting their plan. He never reached her. Bjarke's throw was perfect, technique he had mastered on countless battlefields, where accuracy meant the difference between life and death. His warhammer spun end over end through the air and caught the assassin's center mass, driving him backward with such force that he crashed into a nearby stall and lay still among scattered silver goods and spilled blood. The entire attack had lasted perhaps 30 heartbeats, but its aftermath would echo through the settlement for generations to come. Warriors who had been scattered throughout the marketplace converged on the scene with weapons drawn, their faces grim with the realization of how close they had come to losing their leader. Villagers pressed forward, Voices raised in anger and dismay as they saw the blood staining the market stones. But Bjarke's attention was focused entirely on the small figure who had collapsed near his feet. Elja lay crumpled on the stones, her torn cloak now soaked with crimson, her breathing shallow and rapid. The curved dagger had done more damage than initially apparent. The blade had not only sliced across her shoulder, but had caught her ribs as well, leaving wounds that bled freely despite her attempts to press them closed. "Why?" Bjarke asked softly as he knelt beside her, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he examined her injuries. "Why would you do such a thing?" Elja's eyes fluttered open, focusing with effort on the face above her. Even through the haze of pain and shock, she could see the genuine bewilderment in his expression. This was a man accustomed to loyalty bought with gold or bound by oath, not freely given by someone who owed him nothing. "Because," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing crowd noise. "Because it was right." The simplicity of her answer seemed to strike Bjarke like a physical blow. He stared down at this girl who had never spoken to him, never served in his household, never sworn any oath of fealty, yet who had willingly taken steel meant for his flesh. In a world where loyalty was a commodity to be traded and honor was measured by bloodline, her actions made no sense, and yet they made perfect sense. Ragnar. Bjarke's voice cut through the marketplace din like a blade through silk. "Fetch Sigrid the healer. Tell her to bring everything. This girl will not die for my sake." Ragnar Ironsson, who had been securing the surviving assassins, immediately dispatched 2 warriors to fetch the village's most skilled healer. Others began clearing the marketplace, moving the curious onlookers back to give their leader space to work. But as Bjarke gently lifted Elja from the blood-stained stones, cradling her broken form against his chest with the care one might show a wounded bird, he noticed something that would haunt him for days to come. The girl's torn cloak, now heavy with blood, fell away to reveal the truth of her existence, ribs too prominent beneath pale skin, the gauntness that spoke of chronic hunger, calluses on hands too young to bear such marks. This was not some warrior's daughter who had acted from trained valor, nor a noble's child raised on tales of heroic sacrifice. This was a girl who had nothing, who owned nothing, who was nothing in the eyes of the world, and yet who had given everything without hesitation when the moment demanded courage. As he carried her toward Sigrid's dwelling, her blood seeping into his tunic and her breath growing ever more shallow, Bjarke felt something fundamental shift within his understanding of the world. He had built his reputation on strength, had unified clans through force of arms, had earned respect through the demonstration of power. But this slip of a girl had shown him a different kind of strength entirely, one that had nothing to do with muscle or steel, and everything to do with the size of one's heart. By the time they reached the healer's hut, word of the attack was spreading through Raven's Hollow like wildfire. A nameless girl had saved their war leader's life. The stray had bled for the man who could command armies, and in a culture that valued courage above all else, that simple fact would change everything. Sigrid the healer's dwelling stood apart from the main settlement, positioned where the forest met the fjord in a grove of ancient pine trees that seemed to whisper secrets with every breath of wind. The old woman had tended wounds and delivered children for more than 40 winters, her hands bearing the wisdom that comes only from a lifetime spent fighting death for every soul under her care. When Bjarke carried Elja across her threshold, Sigrid took one look at the girl's ashen face and immediately began issuing orders with the authority of a field commander. "Clear the table," she commanded, gesturing toward a sturdy oak surface that served as her treatment area. "Ragnar, fetch hot water from the kettle. Magnus, I need clean cloth. Tear strips from the linen in that chest. Move quickly, but steady your hands. This one has lost more blood than she can spare." Bjarke laid Elja down with infinite care, his warrior's hands trembling slightly as he brushed a strand of dark hair from her pale forehead. The girl's breathing was shallow, her lips tinged with the blue that spoke of a body struggling to sustain itself. The curved dagger had done its work well, the wounds across her shoulder and ribs gaped open like hungry mouths, weeping crimson onto Sigrid's carefully maintained workspace. "Out," Sigrid said firmly, though not unkindly, as she began cutting away Elja's blood-soaked clothing. "All of you. This work requires concentration, and your presence will only complicate matters." "I will not leave her," Bjarke said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of absolute finality that had settled more than one battlefield dispute. Sigrid paused in her work to study the war leader's face, reading something there that made her nod slowly. "Then sit in that corner and speak not a word. Touch nothing, disturb nothing, and if you faint at the sight of blood, I will have Magnus drag you outside like a green recruit." For the next 3 hours, Bjarke watched the healer work with skills that bordered on the mystical. Sigrid's gnarled fingers moved with sure precision as she cleaned the wounds, her needle drawing flesh back together with tiny, careful stitches that would heal clean if the girl survived the blood loss. She applied poultices made from herbs whose names Bjarke did not know, murmuring prayers to Frigg and Air as she worked to save a life that hung by the thinnest of threads. During the worst moments, when Elja's breathing grew so faint that it seemed she might slip away entirely, Bjarke found himself gripping the arms of his chair with enough force to leave permanent impressions in the wood. This was a different kind of battle than any he had fought, one where his strength and skill meant nothing, where victory or defeat lay entirely in hands more capable than his own. "She is stronger than she appears," Sigrid said during one of the brief respites when she paused to wipe sweat from her brow. "Her body knows survival in ways that soft nobles never learn. The wounds are clean, no poison on that blade, Frigg be praised, and if infection does not set in, she will live." "And if it does?" Bjarke asked quietly. Sigrid's eyes met his with the unflinching honesty of one who had seen too much death to offer false comfort. "Then all our skill will mean nothing, and the gods will decide her fate." As night fell over Raven's Hollow, word of the day's events spread through the settlement like ripples across still water. The story grew with each telling, how the nameless girl had thrown herself between trained assassins and their war leader, how she had taken steel meant for Bjarke's heart, how she lay now between life and death in the healer's hut. Some versions painted her as a hero sent by the gods themselves. Others whispered of strange fate that would move someone with nothing to risk everything. In the great hall, Ragnar Ironsson addressed the assembled warriors with words that would be remembered long after the current generation had joined their ancestors in Valhalla. "Today we learned something about courage that all our battles could not teach us," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the smoke-hazed air. "We learned that the size of one's heart matters more than the size of one's sword arm." The warriors murmured agreement, their usual boisterous evening subdued by the weight of what they had witnessed. These were men who understood valor, who had proven themselves in combat against overwhelming odds. Yet none could claim to have shown the pure, selfless courage displayed by a girl who owned nothing but her principles. Young Eric the Swift, barely past his 20th winter and still eager to prove himself worthy of his place among Bjarke's elite, spoke up from his position near the fire. "What manner of person risks everything for someone they barely know? I have fought beside shield brothers I would die for. But this girl, she had no bond of kinship, no oath of service, no promise of reward." Old Olaf the Wise, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight, stroked his grey beard as he considered the question. "Perhaps that is precisely what made her action so pure. When we fight for kinsmen, we honor blood. When we fight for oath-sworn brothers, we honor duty. When we fight for gold, we honor greed. But when we fight for strangers simply because it is right, that honors something higher than all of these." Magnus Bearslayer, whose massive frame usually dominated any gathering, sat unusually quiet in the corner, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Finally he spoke, his deep voice carrying a note of wonder. "I have slain 12 men in single combat and felt proud of my strength. Today, a girl who could not lift my smallest weapon showed me what true strength looks like." The conversation continued deep into the night, but always it returned to the same central mystery, what had moved Elja to act as she did. Warriors who had spent their lives studying the art of combat found themselves grappling with questions that had no easy answers, wondering if perhaps they had been measuring themselves by the wrong standards all along. Meanwhile, in the healer's hut, Bjarke maintained his vigil through the long hours of darkness. Elja's fever had risen as her body fought to heal itself, and she tossed restlessly on the narrow bed, mumbling words too faint to understand. Sometimes she seemed to be arguing with unseen opponents, her voice growing stronger as she relived the marketplace attack in her dreams. Other times she spoke names that meant nothing to Bjarke, perhaps family she had lost, perhaps friends who existed only in her fevered imagination. But twice during the night, her eyes opened with startling clarity, focusing on his face with an intensity that made him lean forward. "Did I save him?" she whispered during the first awakening, her voice barely audible but filled with desperate concern. "You saved me," Bjarke confirmed gently. "Rest now. The danger has passed." She nodded once and slipped back into unconsciousness, but the second awakening brought a different question entirely. "Why are you here?" she asked, genuine confusion clouding her features. "I am no one important." The question struck Bjarke like a physical blow, revealing just how deeply this girl had internalized the world's judgment of her worth. In her mind, the idea that the war leader himself would sit beside her bed was so impossible that she questioned the evidence of her own eyes. "You are wrong," he said simply. "You are someone very important indeed." But Elja had already drifted back into fever dreams, leaving Bjarke alone with thoughts that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of honor, courage, and the true nature of nobility. Outside, Raven's Hollow slept, but within the healer's hut, a great man wrestled with the realization that greatness might have nothing to do with the things he had spent his life pursuing. Dawn brought with it the sound of many feet gathering outside Sigrid's dwelling, a murmur of voices that grew steadily stronger as the settlement awakened to a changed world. Bjarke stirred from his chair, where he had dozed fitfully, his body stiff from the vigil, but his eyes immediately seeking Elja's face. The girl's fever had broken some time before sunrise, and now she slept naturally, her breathing steady and her color slowly returning to something approaching normal. Sigrid emerged from her herb garden, carrying an armload of fresh plantain and comfrey, her movements betraying none of the exhaustion that a night of life-or-death healing should have brought. She paused at the sight of the crowd gathering outside her door, warriors, craftsmen, farmers, even children pressed close together with faces full of curiosity and concern. "They have been coming since first light," she told Bjarke quietly, setting down her herbs and moving to check Elja's wounds. "Word travels quickly in a settlement this size, and what happened yesterday has touched something deep in people's hearts." Through the small window, Bjarke could see familiar faces among the crowd. There was Thorkel the Black, his usual gruff demeanor softened by genuine worry as he twisted his smith's cap in his massive hands. Beside him stood his wife Astrid, carrying a wooden bowl that likely contained broth or stew, the kind of practical kindness that had always marked her dealings with the nameless girl who slept behind their forge. Young Sven, the fisherman's son, had positioned himself where he could peer through the window, his face pressed against the glass with the intensity of someone keeping watch over a fallen comrade. Old Gunnar leaned heavily on his walking stick, but his eyes were alert with the kind of protective concern usually reserved for blood relatives. "They care for her," Bjarke observed, surprise coloring his voice. "I thought she was truly alone here." Sigrid's weathered hands paused in their examination of Elja's bandages, and when she looked up at the war leader, her expression held a mixture of patience and gentle rebuke. "A person does not have to be claimed to be cherished. This girl has touched more lives than she knows, small kindnesses, moments of shared humanity. The grace that comes from someone who asks for nothing but gives what little she has." As if summoned by their conversation, Elja's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on the unfamiliar surroundings before settling on Bjarke's concerned face. For a moment, she seemed to struggle with memory, her brow furrowing as she tried to reconcile her presence in the healer's hut with her last clear recollection of marketplace stones and blood. "The assassins," she said suddenly, attempting to sit up before Sigurd's firm hand pressed her back down. "Dead or captured," Bjarke assured her. "The threat is ended thanks to your warning and your courage." "I was not courageous," Elja protested weakly. "I was terrified. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely stand." Ragnar Ironsson, who had entered quietly during the exchange, let out a short laugh that held no mockery. "Child, that is precisely what courage is, being terrified and acting anyway. Any fool can fight when he feels no fear. It takes true strength to fight when fear threatens to paralyze you." The sound of voices outside grew louder, and Sigrid moved to the window with a frown. "This will not do. The girl needs rest, not a festival outside her door. Perhaps you should address them, my lord, before their concern becomes disruptive." Bjarke nodded and rose from his chair, but as he moved toward the door, Elja's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, struggling once again to sit up despite Sigrid's disapproving clucks. "I need to understand something. Yesterday in the marketplace, why did you not simply dodge when I called your warning? You are fast enough, skilled enough. You could have avoided their blades without my interference." The question hung in the air, like smoke from a dying fire, and Bjarke found himself considering it seriously. Why had he not simply stepped aside and dealt with the assassins himself? His reflexes were certainly quick enough, his combat experience more than sufficient to handle 3 killers. Even taken by surprise because, he said slowly, working through the realization as he spoke, because in that moment I saw something I had never seen before. Someone willing to throw themselves into mortal danger for a stranger with no hope of reward or recognition. It was so pure, so unexpected, that it paralyzed me more effectively than any weapon could have done. Elja's expression grew troubled. "Then I made things worse. If you had simply handled them yourself—" "You made things right," Bjarke interrupted firmly. "Not easier, not safer, but right. There is a difference, though it took yesterday's events to teach me what that difference truly means." A gentle knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Astrid, the smith's wife, entered carrying her promised bowl of broth, along with a small loaf of dark bread, still warm from the oven. Her usually practical demeanor was softened by genuine affection as she approached Elja's bedside. "Child," she said simply, setting down the food and placing one weathered hand on Elja's forehead to check for fever. "You frightened us all yesterday. Thorkel has been pacing like a caged bear since he heard what happened." "I'm sorry to have caused worry," Elja began, but Astrid waved away the apology with the kind of maternal authority that brooks no argument. "Sorry?" she repeated with a mixture of indignation and amazement. "Child, you saved our war leader's life. You bled for our protection and our peace. The only thing you should be sorry for is not understanding your own worth." Through the window, the crowd continued to grow, and now Bjarke could see that many carried small offerings, flowers from carefully tended gardens, carved wooden trinkets, pieces of their finest cloth. These were not the grand gifts that nobles exchanged, but the humble tokens by which common people express their deepest feelings. "They bring gifts," he told Elja, moving back to the window for a better view. "The entire settlement from the look of it." Elja's eyes widened with disbelief. "Gifts for me? But I have nothing to give in return." "You have already given everything," Sigrid said gently, as she helped the girl sit up enough to manage some broth. "Yesterday you gave your blood, your pain, possibly your life. Today, these people want to give something back to show they understand the value of what you offered. But as the morning progressed and the crowd outside continued to swell, it became clear that something more significant than gratitude was taking shape. Warriors were beginning to arrive, not just Bjarke's household guard, but men from outlying farms and distant settlements who had ridden hard through the night to reach Ravenshollow. Eric the Swift appeared at the door, his usually composed demeanor replaced by an excitement that bordered on awe. "My lord," he said to Bjarke, "you need to see this. Word has spread beyond our settlement. Warriors are coming from the coastal settlements, from the mountain holds, even from the disputed territories. They all want to see the girl who saved your life." Elja paled at this news, shrinking back against her pillows as if she could somehow disappear into the bedding. "I do not understand. I am no one special. I have no name, no family, no achievements worth noting." Bjarke studied her face, seeing in her expression the same confusion he had felt when trying to understand her motivations the day before. It struck him that neither of them had fully grasped what her actions had set in motion, or how profoundly they had challenged everything their culture believed about worth and valor. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "that is exactly why they come." By the third day after the attack, Raven's Hollow had transformed into something unprecedented in its long history. What had begun as a gathering of concerned villagers had evolved into a pilgrimage of sorts, with warriors and common folk arriving from settlements across the northern territories. They came not seeking audience with Bjarke the Unbreakable, though many would have traveled twice as far for that honor, but to see the nameless girl who had redefined their understanding of heroism. Elja remained confined to Sigrid's hut by her injuries and the healer's stern orders, but she could hear the sounds of the growing encampment that now surrounded the dwelling like a protective wall of humanity. Cooking fires crackled throughout the day and into the night, their smoke carrying the mingled aromas of a dozen different regional cuisines as people shared what they had brought for the journey. The sound of voices rose and fell in waves, sometimes heated discussion, sometimes laughter, sometimes the low murmur of prayers offered to various gods. "I have never seen anything like this," Sigrid confided to Bjarke during one of his increasingly frequent visits. "Warriors who have spent years feuding with each other now share bread around the same fire. Men who would normally cross a fjord to avoid meeting are working together to build shelters and tend animals. It is as if your girl has worked some kind of magic." Bjarke looked through the window at the orderly chaos outside, noting how naturally the various groups had organized themselves. The Ironwood clan warriors had taken responsibility for perimeter security, while the coastal fishermen had established a supply line to keep everyone fed. Mountain hunters shared their knowledge of weather patterns, and even the normally suspicious border guards had opened their ranks to accommodate newcomers. "She is not my girl," he said quietly, though something in his tone suggested the words felt false even as he spoke them. "She belongs to no one." "Perhaps," Sigrid replied, with the knowing smile of someone who had witnessed the full spectrum of human nature over her many years. "But you belong to her now, whether you admit it or not. The way you watch over her, the gentleness in your hands when you help tend her wounds, I have seen such devotion before, though rarely between strangers." The healer's words troubled Bjarke more than he cared to admit. He had built his life around clear principles: loyalty to kinsmen, honor in battle, strength in leadership. But Elja had introduced complications that his warrior's training had not prepared him to handle. She had shown him that his understanding of honor was incomplete, that true nobility might have nothing to do with bloodline or battlefield prowess. The carved bone pendant that served as her only link to a forgotten past had been among the personal effects Sigrid had carefully preserved when cutting away her bloodied clothing. Now it lay on the table beside her bed, its simple runic inscription worn smooth by years of handling. Bjarke had studied it during his long vigils, trying to decipher any clue about the girl's origins, but the carving was too weathered to read clearly. "What does it say?" Elja asked weakly, noticing his attention to the pendant during one of her brief periods of full consciousness. "I cannot tell," he admitted. "The inscription is too old, too worn, but the bone itself is whale ivory, carved with skill that speaks of craftsmanship from the far northern settlements. Someone valued you enough to create this with their own hands." Elja touched the pendant with fingertips that trembled slightly from weakness. "I have always wondered if it held answers about who I was before Raven's Hollow. But perhaps knowing would change nothing. The person I am now is shaped by the choices I have made, not the circumstances of my birth." Her words carried a wisdom that impressed Bjarke more than any display of martial skill could have done. Here was someone who had found peace with uncertainty, who had built an identity from conscience rather than inheritance. It was a kind of strength he was only beginning to understand. On the fourth day, a complication arose that threatened to disrupt the peaceful gathering outside Sigrid's hut. Kjell the Ambitious, a minor chieftain from the eastern settlements, arrived with a retinue of 20 warriors and immediately began asserting claims that made everyone uncomfortable. Kjell was known for his skill at turning any situation to his advantage, and his presence cast a shadow over what had been a spontaneous expression of genuine feeling. "This gathering serves no purpose without proper leadership," Kjell announced to anyone who would listen. "These people need organization, direction, someone with the authority to give meaning to their presence here." Ragnar Ironsson, who had been serving as an unofficial coordinator for the various groups, bristled at the implication that their current arrangements were somehow inadequate. "The people organized themselves well enough. They came here freely and maintained themselves without conflict. What more organization do they require?" Kjell's smile carried the cold calculation of a man accustomed to finding weakness in others' strengths. "They came to honor a hero, did they not? But what honor can they offer to someone who has no status to receive it? The girl is nameless, kinless, without position or property. How can such a person properly accept the tribute of warriors?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, and Bjarke felt the subtle shift in atmosphere as people began to consider Kjell's words. It was true that their culture had no established mechanism for honoring someone who existed outside the normal structures of kinship and clan affiliation. Elja's very namelessness, which had made her sacrifice so pure, now threatened to undermine any attempt to formally recognize what she had done. "Perhaps," Kjell continued, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone skilled in public speaking, "the solution lies in providing her with proper status. A adoption into a suitable clan, a marriage arrangement that would give her position, some formal mechanism for integrating her into the structures that govern our society." From inside the hut, Elja had been listening to the discussion with growing alarm. The idea of being claimed, categorized, fitted into someone else's understanding of how the world should work struck her as a kind of death, the death of the person she had fought so hard to become. "They want to make me into something I am not," she told Bjarke when he entered, to check on her condition. "They want to give me a place in their world, but what if I do not want that place?" Bjarke studied her face, seeing in her expression the same fierce independence that had driven her to risk everything for a stranger. "What do you want?" "To remain myself," she said simply. "To continue being someone who acts from conscience rather than obligation, who gives freely rather than from duty. If they make me into a proper member of their society, will I still be capable of the choices that brought me to this moment?" It was a question that cut to the heart of everything that had transpired, and Bjarke found himself without an immediate answer. Outside, Kjell's voice continued to weave arguments that grew more persuasive with each repetition, and the crowd's response suggested that many were beginning to see wisdom in his proposals. The simple purity of Elja's sacrifice was about to collide with the complex realities of a society that could only understand worth through established categories. The confrontation that would define the nature of honor itself began at sunset on the fifth day, when Kjell the Ambitious finally demanded a formal audience with Bjarke. The eastern chieftain had spent the intervening hours building support for his position, speaking quietly with influential warriors and appealing to their sense of proper order. By the time he approached the war leader's temporary camp, he carried with him the implicit backing of nearly a third of the assembled crowd. "We must speak plainly," Kjell announced, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air so that all could hear. "This situation has grown beyond what any of us anticipated. We have warriors camping in the open, resources being strained, and no clear purpose to guide our actions. Something must be decided." Bjarke emerged from Sigrid's hut, where he had been sitting with Elja. his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes holding the warning glint that experienced warriors learn to recognize. "Speak your mind, Kel. What decision troubles you so greatly?" "The girl has shown courage worthy of recognition," Kel began, his words chosen with the precision of a man who understood the power of public rhetoric. "But courage without context is merely impulse. She needs status, position, a proper place within our society if her actions are to have lasting meaning." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, some nodding agreement while others shifted uncomfortably. The division was not along clan lines, as might have been expected, but seemed to reflect deeper philosophical differences about the nature of worth and recognition. "And what status would you propose?" Bjarke asked quietly, though everyone present could sense the dangerous currents beneath his calm tone. Kjell's smile held the confidence of a man who believed he had identified the perfect solution. "Adoption into my household? The girl would take my family name, receive proper training in the skills befitting a warrior's daughter, and eventually be married to a suitable partner who could provide her with permanent security. She would want for nothing, and her heroic deed would be properly honored within the established structures of our culture." The proposal hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, and the silence that followed was so complete that the crackling of cooking fires seemed loud as thunder. Then from inside the hut came a sound that no one had expected, Elja's laughter, clear and genuine despite her weakness. "May I hear what the girl herself thinks of this generous offer?" Bjarke called toward the hut, his voice carrying just enough edge to make Kjell shift uncomfortably. Elja appeared in the doorway, supported by Sigrid's steadying arm, but standing under her own power for the first time since the attack. Her face was still pale, her movements careful to avoid straining her healing wounds, but her eyes held a clarity that commanded attention from every person present. "I am grateful for the chieftain's offer," she said, her voice carrying farther than anyone would have expected from someone so recently near death. "But I must respectfully decline." Kjell's confident expression faltered slightly. "Child, perhaps you do not understand the advantages." "I understand perfectly," Elja interrupted with gentle firmness. "You offer me security, status, a place in your world. These are valuable things, and I do not dismiss them lightly. But they come with a price I am not willing to pay." "What price?" called out Magnus Bearslayer from somewhere in the crowd, his deep voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Elja was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts while the entire assembly waited with the patience of people who sensed they were about to hear something important. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of deep reflection. "If I become Kjell's adopted daughter, I am no longer the person who chose to act in the marketplace. I become someone with obligations, expectations, a defined role that dictates my choices. The next time I see injustice, I will have to consider whether my response serves my clan's interests, whether it fits my station, whether it aligns with my family's alliances." She paused, her hand unconsciously touching the bone pendant at her throat. But the person who saved Bjarke's life had no such considerations. She acted purely from conscience alone because action was needed and she was there to provide it. That purity is precious to me. It is perhaps the only thing of value I truly possess. Old Olaf the Wise stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. "You speak of remaining free to act according to conscience, but freedom without protection is dangerous, child. What happens when you are too old or too weak to survive on scraps and charity? What happens when winter comes harder than usual, or when those who might harm you realize you have no clan to avenge your injuries?" It was a practical question that struck at the heart of survival in their harsh world, and Elja nodded acknowledgement of its wisdom. "I do not know," she admitted. "But I know that trading my freedom for security today guarantees that I will never again be capable of the choice that brought us all to this moment." Astrid, the smith's wife, pushed through, the crowd carrying a worn wooden bowl, her practical nature asserting itself in the midst of philosophical debate. "Child," she said firmly, "you speak as if accepting help means losing yourself. But you have been accepting help for years. My bread, Thorkel's shelter, Gunnar's cast-off nets. Did those kindnesses make you less free to act according to your conscience?" The question clearly struck home, and Elja considered it carefully before responding. "You are right, of course. But the help you offered came without conditions, without expectations of change or compliance. You fed me because I was hungry, not because you wanted to shape me into something specific. And what if we could offer protection in the same spirit?" Ragnar Ironson asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations that had begun to spring up around the edges of the gathering. "What if there were a way to honor your choice without requiring you to surrender the freedom that made that choice possible?" All eyes turned to the red-bearded warrior, whose expression suggested he was working through an idea even as he spoke. Gjel's face darkened with the realization that his carefully constructed proposal was about to face serious competition. "Speak plainly." "Ragnar," Bjarke commanded. Though his tone suggested interest rather than impatience, Ragnar stepped into the center of the gathering, his bearing taking on the formal quality of someone about to make an important proposal. "What if we created something new? Not adoption into an existing clan, not marriage alliance, not any of the traditional structures. What if we offered our protection freely, as she offered her courage freely?" "That is not how our society works," Chell protested, his carefully constructed confidence beginning to show cracks. "Protection requires obligation, mutual benefit, some structure of reciprocal duty. You cannot simply—" "Can we not?" interrupted a voice from the crowd. It was young Sven, the fisherman's son, stepping forward with the awkward courage of youth, challenging established authority. "She showed us that someone can give everything and ask nothing in return. Why can we not do the same for her?" The idea spread through the gathering like fire through dry grass, warriors and common folk alike beginning to nod and murmur agreement. But Kjell was not finished, and his next words carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to having his way. "This is foolishness," he declared. "Pretty sentiment that ignores practical reality. The girl needs structure, guidance, proper training. Without these things, her courage will eventually lead her into situations where good intentions cannot compensate for lack of skill." It was then that Elja surprised everyone, including herself, with the firmness of her response. "Then teach me." The words hung in the evening air like a challenge thrown down before the gods themselves, and for a moment the entire gathering seemed to hold its breath. Elja's simple request, "Then teach me," had transformed what should have been a discussion about charity into something far more dangerous. A proposal that someone without bloodline, without clan affiliation, without any of the traditional markers of worthiness, should receive the training reserved for the children of warriors. Chell's laugh came sharp and dismissive. "Teach you what, child? To swing a sword you lack the strength to lift? To wear armor that would crush your small frame? To ride war horses trained to respond only to their masters' bloodlines? Some things cannot be learned by those not born to them." But Bjarke was studying Elja's face with the intensity of a man who had spent his life reading the true intentions behind spoken words. What he saw there was not the desperate bravado of someone trying to prove themselves, but the quiet determination of someone who had already proven everything that mattered. "What would you learn?" he asked quietly, his question cutting through Kjell's continued protests. Elja straightened, despite the pull of her healing wounds. And when she spoke, her voice carried the clarity of someone who had thought deeply about her answer. "Not to become a warrior in the traditional sense. I will never have the size or strength for that path. But to become someone capable of protecting others as I was unable to protect myself that day in the marketplace." She gestured toward the assembled crowd, her movement encompassing warriors and farmers, craftsmen and hunters, all united in their shared recognition of something greater than individual achievement. "These people have shown me that protection can take many forms. Thorkel protects with the weapons he forges. Astrid protects with the food she provides. Sigrid protects with her healing knowledge. I want to learn how to protect with purpose rather than merely good intentions. Ragnar Ryansson stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. And if we agreed to such teaching, what would you offer in return? Training requires resources, time, expertise. What could you provide that would justify such investment? The question was not meant as a challenge, but as a practical consideration that needed addressing if any unusual arrangement were to work. Elja was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of what she was proposing. "Offer the same thing I offered in the marketplace," she said finally. "My willingness to stand between harm and those who need protection, regardless of their ability to reward me for it." Old Gunnar, who had been leaning heavily on his walking stick at the edge of the crowd, suddenly straightened with an expression of startled recognition. His weathered face had gone pale, and his eyes were fixed on Elja's bone pendant with an intensity that made everyone nearby turn to follow his gaze. "Child," he said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of wonder and disbelief, "may I see that pendant you wear?" Elja touched the carved bone at her throat, confused by the old fisherman's sudden interest. "It is nothing special, just a piece of whale ivory with some worn inscription that no one can read." But Gunnar was already moving forward with surprising speed for his age, his walking stick forgotten as he approached her with hands that trembled slightly. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, he lifted the pendant with infinite care, turning it toward the firelight to examine the inscription more closely. The silence that followed was so complete that the distant sound of waves against the fjord shore seemed loud as thunder. Gunnar's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, recognition, and something approaching awe as he studied the worn carving. "Blessed Frigg," he whispered finally. "I know this hand. I know this carving." Bjarke stepped closer, his voice carrying the tone of a man who sensed that everything was about to change. "Speak plainly, Gunnar. What do you see?" The old fisherman's eyes, bright with unshed tears, moved from the pendant to Elja's face and back again. This pendant was carved by Eriksson the Wise, master craftsman of the northern reaches. I would know his work anywhere. I apprenticed under him for 5 years in my youth. But more than that, he paused, his voice breaking slightly. I know what this inscription says because I watched him carve it 17 years ago. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to hear something that would reshape their understanding of everything that had transpired. Even Kjell had abandoned his protests, his face reflecting the same anticipation that gripped everyone present. "The inscription," Gunnar continued, his voice growing stronger as memory overcame emotion, "reads Elja, daughter of storm and starlight, beloved of Freydis the Shield Maiden." The name hit the gathering like a physical blow. Freydis the Shield Maiden was legend, a warrior woman whose exploits had become the stuff of saga, whose courage in battle had earned her a place among the most celebrated heroes of their people. She had disappeared 15 years ago, while on a mission to the far northern settlements, and no trace of her or her small company had ever been found. "Freydis," Bjarke repeated slowly, his mind working through the implications. "You are saying this girl is the daughter of the greatest shield maiden in living memory," Gunnar confirmed. "Freydis brought her to our settlement as a babe when political troubles made the northern reaches too dangerous. She stayed only long enough to ensure the child would be cared for, then departed on what she said was to be her final mission. She left this pendant as proof of the girl's heritage, to be revealed when she came of age." Elja had gone very still, her hand moving unconsciously to cover the pendant, as if she could somehow shield herself from this revelation. "That cannot be true," she said quietly. "I'm no one special. I have no noble blood, no heroic heritage. I am just someone who threw herself between assassins and their target without thought for personal safety," Ragnar interrupted gently. "Just someone who risked everything to protect a stranger. Just someone who shows the same pure courage that made your mother a legend." The revelation explained so much, the unconscious grace with which Elja moved despite her lack of formal training, the instinctive courage that had driven her actions in the marketplace. the quiet dignity that had marked all her interactions despite her humble circumstances. She was not merely a nameless orphan who had acted from simple goodness, but the daughter of a hero, carrying in her blood the legacy of legendary courage. But the revelation also complicated everything. Yell's face had already begun to show the calculating interest of someone who recognized opportunity, while other chieftains in the crowd were clearly reassessing their positions based on this new information. A nameless girl could be ignored or patronized. The daughter of Freydis the Shield Maiden was a different matter entirely. "This changes nothing," Elja said firmly, though her voice carried a slight tremor that suggested the words cost her some effort. "I am still the same person who made the choice in the marketplace. Learning my mother's name does not alter the reasons for my actions or the value of what I offered." But even as she spoke, she could see in the faces around her that everything had indeed changed. The simple purity of her sacrifice, which had touched something deep in the hearts of common warriors and farmers, was now overlaid with the complex politics of bloodline and inheritance. She was no longer just a heroic, nameless girl, but a potential political asset, a living link to legendary greatness. A prize to be claimed rather than a person to be honored. Bjarke seemed to read her thoughts, for when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute command. "The girl is right. This changes nothing about what she chose to do or why she chose to do it. She acted not as Freydis' daughter but as Elja herself. And it is Elja who will decide her own path forward." But even his words could not restore the simple clarity that had existed before Gunnar's revelation. The daughter of a legend could never again be truly nameless, and the implications of that loss would reshape everything that followed. The dawn of the seventh day brought with it an urgency that had been building since Gunnar's revelation about Elja's true heritage. Word of Freydis, the Shield Maiden's daughter, had spread beyond Raven's Hollow with the speed of wildfire, carried by messengers who rode hard through the night to distant settlements. By sunrise, the encampment around Sigrid's hut had swollen to include representatives from every major clan within 3 days' ride, each bearing their own interpretation of what this discovery meant for the future. Bjarke stood at the window of the healer's dwelling, watching the careful choreography of political maneuvering that played out among the various factions now present. The Ironwood clan had allied themselves with the coastal settlements in supporting what they called the girl's right to choose her own path. The mountain clans favored a more traditional approach, suggesting that Elja should be formally claimed by her mother's surviving kinsman. The eastern chieftains, led by Kjell, continued to press for arrangements that would bring her under established authority structures, but it was the arrival of the final group that had transformed the situation from complex to potentially explosive. The Northern Reach survivors, men who had served under Freydis herself, had ridden south with faces grim as winter storms and weapons that spoke of recent use. Their leader, Thorvald Ironarm, had been Freydis' lieutenant and closest friend, and his claim to speak for her daughter carried the weight of blood-sworn loyalty. "She belongs with us," Thorvald had declared upon his arrival, his scarred face showing no willingness to compromise. Freydis entrusted her daughter to strangers only for protection during her childhood. Now that the girl has reached maturity and proven herself worthy of her mother's legacy, it is time for her to take her rightful place among her own people. The statement had divided the gathering along lines that had nothing to do with traditional clan loyalties and everything to do with fundamental questions about identity, choice, and the nature of obligation. Even among Bjarke's own warriors, opinions differed sharply about what honor demanded in such circumstances. Inside the hut, Elja sat propped against pillows that Sigrid had arranged to support her healing back, her face reflecting the strain of the past day's revelations. The bone pendant lay in her palm as she studied it with new eyes, seeing in its worn surface not just a mysterious artifact, but a deliberate message from a mother she could not remember. "I have been thinking about courage," she said quietly to Bjarke. who had taken his customary position in the chair beside her bed, about whether it means the same thing when it comes from training and expectation rather than simple. Good choice. Bjarke set down the correspondence he had been reading, reports from his various holdings and requests for guidance from subordinates who were struggling to understand the political implications of recent events. What conclusion have you reached? That I am afraid, Elja admitted, her honesty carrying the same stark simplicity that had marked all her significant statements. Not of physical danger that I understand now after the marketplace, but afraid of becoming someone other than who I chose to be. Through the thin walls, they could hear the voices of the various factions engaged in increasingly heated debate. The discussions had grown more formal as the stakes became clear, with each group presenting structured arguments for their position rather than the spontaneous expressions of feeling that had characterized the gathering's early days. Ragnar Ironson appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled in a way that Bjarke had learned to recognize as a warning of serious complications. My lord, we need to speak privately. The situation outside has developed beyond what any of us anticipated. Bjarke rose and followed his lieutenant outside, leaving Elja alone with her thoughts and the constant murmur of voices that surrounded the hut like the sound of distant thunder. What he saw in the encampment made him understand immediately why Ragnar's expression had been so grim. The various factions were no longer simply debating among themselves, but had begun to organize along military lines. Weapons that had been worn casually were now being worn purposefully. Warriors were checking equipment with the systematic attention that preceded serious conflict. Most troubling of all, the different groups were positioning themselves with clear sight, lines and ready access to their horses, the kind of tactical arrangements that suggested they were preparing for the possibility of violence. How did it reach this point? Bjarke asked quietly, though he could already see the answer in the tense postures and watchful eyes around him. Thorvald issued what amounts to an ultimatum, Ragnar explained, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard. He claims the right to take Elja north with him immediately, based on her mother's original intentions. When Kjell and the others objected, Thorvald suggested that anyone who opposed the rightful claims of Freydis's kin was welcome to settle the matter through combat. The situation had escalated beyond political maneuvering into the realm of honor challenges, where words carried the weight of sworn oaths and withdrawal became impossible without loss of face. In their culture, once such lines were drawn, resolution could only come through decisive action, either complete capitulation by one side or formal combat to determine whose position carried the favor of the gods. And the girl's wishes in all this? Bjarke asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Have become secondary to the larger question of who has the authority to speak for her, Ragnar replied grimly. Each faction claims to represent her true interests, but none seems particularly interested in asking what those interests might actually be. Bjarke studied the positions of the various groups, reading in their arrangements the likelihood of immediate violence. The Northern Reach warriors were outnumbered, but held the advantage of unity and superior training. The Eastern chieftains had brought the most men, but lacked the cohesion that came from shared purpose. His own people held the center ground both literally and figuratively, but their attempts at mediation were increasingly viewed as favoritism toward whatever position they seemed to support. There will be blood before sunset if this continues, he concluded, the certainty in his voice carrying the weight of long experience in reading the signs that preceded battle. Worse than that, Ragnar said quietly. There will be a war that splits every clan along new lines, with Freydis's daughter as the prize, and her own wishes irrelevant to the outcome. It was then that Elja herself appeared in the doorway, supported by Sigrid's arm, but moving under her own power with visible determination. Her face was pale, but her eyes held the same clarity that had marked her most important decisions. I can hear everything from inside, she said simply. The raised voices, the sound of weapons being prepared, the movement of people choosing sides for a conflict I never wanted. This has gone far enough. Thorvald Ironarm noticed her appearance and immediately strode forward, his scarred face softening with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Child," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone greeting a beloved relative. "You look so much like your mother at your age. She would be proud to see the courage you have shown, would she?" Elja asked quietly. "Would she be proud to see warriors preparing to shed blood over who has the right to control her daughter's choices?" The question stopped Thorvald mid-stride, and something in his expression suggested that he was beginning to recognize the contradiction between honoring Freydis's memory and ignoring the very independence that had made her legendary. "Your mother was the freest person I ever knew," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of profound memory. "She answered to no authority but her own conscience, followed no law but her own understanding of right and wrong. I served her not because she commanded me, but because I chose to follow someone whose choices I respected. Then honor that freedom by extending it to me," Elja replied with gentle firmness. "Do not force me to become something my mother would never have been, a prize to be claimed rather than a person to be respected." But even as she spoke, the movement around them continued to accelerate toward inevitable confrontation. Kjell had begun issuing orders to his men with the crisp efficiency of someone preparing for immediate action. The coastal warriors were forming loose formations that would allow them to support each other if violence erupted. Even the normally peaceful farmers and craftsmen were backing away from the central area, recognizing that they were about to witness something far beyond their ability to influence. "There has to be another way," Elja said, though her voice carried a note of desperation that suggested she was running out of ideas. "Some solution that honors everyone's concerns without requiring anyone to surrender their principles through force." Bjarke looked at her face, seeing in her expression the same desperate determination that had driven her to throw herself between assassins and their target. She was preparing to take another enormous risk, to offer herself in some way that might prevent the violence gathering around them like storm clouds. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly, though something in his tone suggested he already feared the answer. "That perhaps the only way to end this is to make a choice so clear, so definitive, that further argument becomes impossible," she replied. "A choice that honors my mother's legacy while establishing my own path forward." Before anyone could respond, she stepped forward into the center of the gathering, her voice rising to carry clearly to every person present. "I call for the ancient right of judgment by ordeal." The words struck the gathering like lightning splitting ancient oak, and for a moment that stretched toward eternity, absolute silence reigned over the encampment. The ancient right of judgment by ordeal had not been invoked in living memory. It belonged to the old ways, when disputes beyond human resolution were submitted to the gods themselves for final determination. Thorvald Ironarm was the first to find his voice, his scarred face reflecting disbelief and something approaching horror. "Child, you cannot know what you ask. The ordeal is not some symbolic gesture. It is trial by fire, by ice, by combat with forces beyond mortal strength. Those who call upon it stake their very lives on the outcome." "I know exactly what I ask," Elja replied, her voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had marked her most crucial decisions. "I ask for the gods to judge whether I am truly free to choose my own path, or whether the circumstances of my birth bind me to obligations I never accepted." Kjell stepped forward, his calculating mind immediately grasping the implications of what she proposed. "The ordeal requires formal structure, witness from all parties, specific terms for what each outcome would mean. You cannot simply declare your intention and expect the terms are simple," Elja interrupted with calm authority. "If I survive the ordeal and prove worthy of divine favor, then I'm free to choose my path without interference from any clan or faction. If I fail, then I submit to whatever arrangements those present deem appropriate." Old Olaf the Wise emerged from the crowd, his weathered face grave with the weight of ancient knowledge. "Child, the ordeal you propose requires 3 trials, one each of courage, wisdom, and endurance. These are not tests that can be passed through good intentions alone. They demand skills you have not learned, strength you have not built, knowledge you have not acquired. Then I will fail," Elja said simply. "And in failing, I will at least have failed as myself, rather than succeeded as someone else's creation." Bjarke stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "There is still time to choose differently. Accept training, accept protection, accept guidance, but do not stake your life on a principle." She turned to face him fully, and in her eyes he saw the same desperate courage that had driven her into the marketplace fight. But deeper now, seasoned by days of reflection and sharpened by the clarity that comes only from facing the ultimate choice. "You taught me something that day in the marketplace," she said quietly. "You showed me that sometimes the size of your heart matters more than the size of your sword. But these people want to give me swords, armor, training, all the external things that might make me safer. What they cannot give me is a heart that chooses freely." Ragnar Ironson approached with the measured steps of someone who recognized that they stood at a moment that would reshape everything that followed. If the ordeal is truly to be invoked, it must be done properly. The ancient laws require specific preparations, formal witness, sacred ground, prepared according to traditional methods. "How long?" Elja asked. 3 days, Olaf replied. 3 days to prepare the trials, to sanctify the ground, to ensure that all aspects of the ritual conform to the old ways. 3 days for you to reconsider this choice and select a safer path. Elja nodded slowly, her decision clearly unshakable despite the magnitude of what she faced. 3 days then. But understand this, I will not spend those days being trained or coached or prepared by anyone seeking to influence the outcome. I will face the gods' judgment as I am, not as others would make me. Thorvald Ironarm stepped forward, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to easily read. "Your mother once said something I have never forgotten. She said that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear. I see that same judgment in your eyes now. What was more important to her than fear?" Elja asked softly. "The right to choose her own battles," Thorvald replied. "The freedom to stand or fall based on her own decisions, rather than others' expectations." As the full implications of Elja's decision settled over the gathering, the various factions began to shift their positions once again. The immediate threat of violence receded as everyone recognized that the girl herself had taken control of the situation in a way that transcended their political maneuvering, but the ordeal she had chosen carried stakes far higher than any armed conflict could have imposed. In 3 days, she would face trials that had claimed the lives of heroes whose names were carved in stone and sung in saga. She would stake everything on her worthiness to choose her own path, knowing that failure meant not just the loss of freedom, but quite possibly the loss of life itself. The ancient rite would determine whether Elja's courage was truly divine or merely human, and whether the freedom she prized above all else was something she had earned the right to claim. The sacred grove, where the ordeal would take place, lay 3 miles inland from Raven's Hollow, where ancient pines created a natural amphitheater around a clearing that had witnessed such trials in the distant past. Stone markers carved with runic inscriptions formed a perfect circle around the consecrated ground, their weathered surfaces bearing the names of those who had sought divine judgment in ages past. Some names were followed by symbols of triumph, others by markers that spoke of noble failure. On the morning of the ordeal, nearly 500 people gathered to witness what many believed would be the most significant trial by divine judgment in living memory. Warriors, farmers, craftsmen, and even children arranged themselves according to strict protocols that Olaf the Wise had reconstructed from ancient texts and half-remembered traditions. Elja stood at the eastern edge of the circle wearing simple white robes that Sigrid had woven specifically for the occasion, her dark hair unbound and flowing free as tradition demanded. Her wounded shoulder had healed enough to allow movement, but not enough to restore full strength. And everyone present could see the careful way she held herself to avoid straining the still tender flesh. The first trial, the test of courage, required her to walk barefoot across a bed of coals that had been burning since dawn, their orange glow visible even in the morning sunlight. But this was not merely a test of physical endurance. The coals had been arranged in patterns that told the story of her mother's greatest victory, and Elja was required to recite that saga as she crossed, proving both her knowledge of her heritage and her ability to maintain mental clarity despite physical trial. "I have never heard this story," she confessed to Bjarke, who stood as her chosen witness according to the ancient protocols. "How can I recite what I do not know?" "Then you must trust that the knowledge will come when needed," he replied quietly. "The ordeal tests not just what you know, but what you can discover within yourself when everything depends upon it." Thorvald Ironarm approached, carrying a horn filled with mead that had been blessed by every spiritual leader present. "Your mother drank from this same horn before her first great battle," he said solemnly. "She believed it contained not magic, but memory, the accumulated wisdom of all who had shown courage before her." Elja accepted the horn and drank deeply, the blessed mead burning her throat like liquid fire while somehow steadying her nerves. As she handed it back, she noticed that her hands no longer trembled, and her breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of someone prepared for ordeal. The trial began at precisely noon, when the sun stood directly overhead and cast no shadows that might provide guidance or comfort. Elja approached the bed of coals with measured steps, her bare feet testing the heat that radiated from the glowing embers. The first step onto the burning path sent pain shooting through her body like nothing she had ever experienced. But her voice remained steady as she began to speak. "Freydis, the shield maiden, stood alone upon the frozen battlefield," she began, the words flowing from some deep well of knowledge she had not known she possessed. Behind her lay the broken shields of her companions, and before her advanced the war band that had slaughtered 2 villages in their march toward the sacred temple. Step by step, word by word, she crossed the burning coals while reciting a saga she had never learned, her voice growing stronger as the story unfolded. She spoke of Freydis's tactical brilliance, her supernatural endurance, her final victory over impossible odds, and with each detail, it became clear that the knowledge came not from study, but from something deeper and more fundamental. The second trial tested wisdom through a complex riddle that required understanding not just of words, but of the deeper principles that governed their society. Standing before a stone altar carved with interlocking symbols, Elja was required to explain the relationship between freedom and responsibility, between individual choice and communal obligation. "Freedom without responsibility is merely selfishness," she said, her voice carrying across the silent gathering. "But responsibility without choice is slavery. True wisdom lies in choosing one's responsibilities freely, then honoring them completely." The answer satisfied the ancient requirements. But the final trial would test whether her philosophy could withstand the ultimate challenge. The test of endurance required her to remain alone in the sacred grove from sunset to sunrise, with no shelter, no fire, and no protection save her own inner strength. During those dark hours, she would face whatever visions or challenges the gods chose to send. As evening approached and the crowd began to withdraw to a respectful distance, Elja prepared to face the longest night of her life, knowing that dawn would bring either vindication of her choices or the end of everything she had fought to become. Dawn broke over the sacred grove, with a gentleness that seemed to acknowledge the significance of what had transpired during the night. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the ancient pines and illuminated the stone circle, the gathered witnesses saw a sight that would be remembered in song and story for generations to come. Elja sat in the exact center of the consecrated ground, her white robes unmarked despite the long hours of solitude, her face serene with the peace that comes only from trials successfully endured. Around her in perfect formation sat a circle of ravens, 12 of the great blackbirds that served as messengers to the gods themselves. They had appeared sometime during the dark hours and remained as silent guardians until the moment the sun touched the treetops, then risen as one to disappear into the morning sky. The symbolism was unmistakable to everyone present. Ravens were Odin's companions, bearers of wisdom and divine favor. Their presence throughout the night and their departure at dawn spoke to divine approval more clearly than any formal pronouncement could have done. Bjarke was the first to enter the circle, moving with the careful reverence of someone approaching sacred ground. He found Elja exactly as she appeared from a distance, unharmed, unbroken, and possessed of a quiet dignity that seemed to have deepened during her solitary vigil. "The night was long," he said simply, offering his hand to help her rise. "The night was necessary," she replied, accepting his assistance, but standing under her own power with the grace of someone who had discovered new strength within themselves. "I learned things that could only be learned in darkness and solitude." As the witnesses gathered around the edge of the circle, Elja addressed them with words that carried the authority of someone who had faced divine judgment and emerged victorious. "I have passed the trials and earned the right to choose my path freely," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every person present. "But freedom is meaningless unless it is used in service of something greater than oneself." She paused, her gaze moving across the faces of all who had gathered to witness her ordeal, warriors and farmers, nobles and common folk, all united in their recognition of something extraordinary. "I choose to remain here in Raven's Hollow, not as anyone's adopted daughter or political asset, but as someone committed to protecting those who need protection. I will accept training from any who offer it freely, guidance from any who give it without seeking to control, and friendship from any who value the person I am rather than the heritage I carry." Thorvald Ironarm stepped forward, his scarred face reflecting a mixture of disappointment and profound respect. "Your mother would be proud," he said simply. "You have chosen the same path she did, to be owned by no one, bound by nothing save your own conscience." Kjell the Ambitious, who had watched the entire ordeal with growing recognition that his political calculations had been rendered irrelevant, offered a formal bow that acknowledged both defeat and admiration. "I misjudged what honor required," he admitted. "True nobility cannot be imposed from without. It must arise from within." But it was the response of the common people that would prove most significant in the days to come. One by one, the farmers and craftsmen, the fishermen and hunters who had witnessed Elja's trials began to approach the circle. They carried no grand gifts or formal pronouncements, but simple offerings that spoke to genuine affection. Flowers from carefully tended gardens, small carvings made during the long hours of waiting, pieces of bread still warm from morning ovens. Old Gunnar was among the first to reach her, his weathered hands holding a new fishing net woven from the finest cord he possessed. "For someone who has learned to catch more than fish," he said with a smile that made his lined face look decades. Younger Astrid, the smith's wife, followed with a thick woolen cloak dyed in the deep blue that marked the finest craftsmanship. "For cold nights when you stand watch over others," she said simply. Young Sven presented a small wooden carving of a raven, its wings spread in flight. "So you remember that the gods themselves witnessed your courage," he explained with the serious expression of someone offering a treasure. As the sun climbed higher and the formal aspects of the ordeal concluded, something remarkable began to unfold. The warriors who had come seeking to claim or control Elja instead began offering to serve under her guidance. The simple recognition of her worth had transformed into something deeper, a genuine desire to be part of whatever she chose to build. "We could form something new," Ragnar Ironson suggested, his red beard thoughtful in the morning light, not bound by traditional clan structures or political obligations, but united by shared principles. A brotherhood and sisterhood of those committed to protecting the innocent. The idea took root with surprising speed, spreading through the gathering like seeds on fertile ground. Within hours, more than 50 warriors had pledged themselves to what they began calling the Order of the Raven, taking their name from the divine messengers who had blessed Elja's vigil. Bjarke watched these developments with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice done and wisdom honored. "You have done something I thought impossible," he told Elja, as the day moved toward evening and the various groups began to prepare for their journeys home. "You have created unity without conquest, loyalty without obligation, strength without domination. I have simply chosen to be myself," she replied with the same simplicity that had marked all her most profound statements. Sometimes that is enough. As the stars emerged overhead and Raven's Hollow settled into the peaceful rhythm of a community that had witnessed greatness, Elja stood once more beside Thorkel's forge where her journey had begun. But now she was no longer the nameless girl seeking shelter from the cold. She was Elja, daughter of storm and starlight, protector of the innocent, founder of something entirely new, and in the distance, carried on the evening wind, came the sound of ravens calling, a reminder that some choices echo through eternity, touching hearts and changing the world in ways too deep for understanding, too pure for anything but wonder.